So welcome everyone. I'm Michael Woodford from the Department of Economics. Here to welcome you to an event sponsored by our Program for Economic Research. It's a great pleasure to have Francesco Giavazzi here to speak to us. As many of you know, he's a professor of economics at Bocconi University in Milan, which is probably the most distinguished Italian faculty for economics and business. He's been there for a long time. Among other things, he was the founding director of IGIR, the Innocenzo Gasparini Institute for Economic Research at Bocconi, which has done a lot to increase the international visibility of research there. He's also a research fellow and trustee of the Center for Economic Policy Research in London and a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research here in the US. His scholarly career is much too extensive for me to try to summarize. He has written or edited at least 16 books so far. Just to mention some of the more notable things, he's very well known as an expert on exchange rate policy, exchange rate systems, and especially on fiscal policy. Apart from his scholarly activities, Professor Giavazzi has been very much involved in public service, both in Italy and in Europe. To mention some of the high points of that, he was Director General of the Italian Treasury between 1992 and 1994, responsible for debt management and privatization. He was then a member of the Council of Economic Advisors to the Italian Prime Minister from 1998 to 2000 in the Dilemma government. And more recently, he was a member of the Group of Economic Policy Advisors to the President of the European Commission from 2000 to 2010. He's also plays a very important role in Europe as a public intellectual, and those of you who follow the Italian press probably already know him as a regular economic columnist for the Corriere della Sera. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Francesco Giavazzi to talk to us about Italy's future on the eve of what many are expecting may be a historic turning point in this upcoming election. Francesco Giavazzi.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you all for coming in this cold night. So this is a talk about the future of Italy 5 days ahead of the election. So I think the discussion after the talk will be more interesting than the talk itself. So the talk itself is about where Italy stands, and at the end some thoughts about what could lie ahead. I want to start with a slide which I think gives an overall picture of what has happened to the Italian economy in the past 20 years. So this is income per capita, setting the United States at 100, from which you can see that back in 1990, France, Italy, and Germany were at the same point, but then Italy, which is the red line, declined. Germany, which is the green line, also declines, but that is due to the impact on the German economy of German unification in the 90s. But then you see that early in the past decade, the trends diverge, and income per capita in Germany, that now includes Eastern Germany, starts rising, while the one for Italy declining. And this is the concern, that there has been, for the past 20 years, a steady decline in income per capita, that it's a measure that you could think of it as very close to the real wage that people take home. So I want to do two things. First, I want to start from the short run and discuss what has happened in Italy in the past couple of years, so the big crisis that peaked in the summer of 2011, because this, I think, is a good introduction of the longer-term problem that Italy faces today. But keep this picture in mind, because we're going to return to this later. So debts and deficits. So where was Italy before the financial crisis? So this is the fiscal situation of the country in 2007. And what I wrote here, fragile but not insolvent, is a description. It was fragile because when you have a high debt to GDP ratio, which at the time was 120%, you are very fragile. Any small movement in interest rate can move you out of course. But given the numbers of 2007, it was not insolvent. Nominal growth was 2%, so real growth was small but positive 1% inflation. The average cost of debt was relatively moderate, 4.5%, moderate for a country that had 120% debt to GDP. The maturity was very long, 7 years. So if interest rate moved today before they affect the entire structure of the debt, takes a long time. To keep the debt stable, you would have needed a 3% primary surplus, so a surplus of the budget net of interest rate, and Italy had 3.5. So it was, actually debt was slowly falling, very slowly falling. So it was fragile, but not insolvent. Then comes the recession associated with the financial crisis, which hit Italy in a particularly strong way. So output in 08-09 fell, summing the 2 years, almost 7%, 6.7%. In the euro area as a whole, including Greece and Spain, it fell 4%. So it fell much more than the euro area. Now this is a puzzle which I think has not been studied, and if there are students here who are interested, it would be a good case study to understand why did the Italian economy, where remember there was no housing bubble, there were no derivatives in the banking system. If you looked at it, it was financially one of the strongest economies of the euro area. Why did output fall by much more than in countries like Spain, where the financial situation was weaker? Not only output fell in 08-09, but then in 10-11, when there was this temporary recovery in the euro area, output turned positive 1%, but still half. In the rest of the euro area was 1.8. So the recovery, the fall was deeper, the recovery was lower. So what happened? That looking at this, looking at an economy that was fragile and that fell into this big hole, markets got worried and lost confidence. And when you lose confidence and you had 120% debt to GDP ratio, you can get in trouble very fast. So this is what happened to the interest rate on Italian government bonds of various maturity, 3, 5, and 10 years. This is what happened in the summer fall of 2011, when eventually the Berlusconi government gave up as a result of the financial crisis. So the marginal cost of the debt went from 4.5% up to 7.5%. Now, when you have a high debt, this is a big trouble, because at that point, when the average cost of debt was slowly, because the maturity was longer, was slowly rising to 7%, the primary surplus Italy would have needed to keep the debt stable was no longer 3.5, which is the situation before the crisis, but increased to around 7-8%. Of course, a lot depends on what growth does. So the actual numbers, which were -1 real growth and 1% inflation, meant that the primary surplus would have been 8%. It was actually smaller than 3.5 because of the recession, so the debt started rising a lot. There was a discussion at this point among economists. Olivier Blanchard, the economic advisor of the IMF, had the view that Italy had simply shifted to a bad equilibrium. So we know when you have a high debt, a shock comes, you move to a bad equilibrium because market lose confidence for any reason, because it's a bad day or it's raining, and you get into trouble. And Olivier's point was you just have to do something to bring back confidence and you are fine. I think that this was not the case. I think that the loss of confidence is because markets saw output fall. They realized that even in the turnaround in 10-11, output did not start rising at least as fast as the rest of the euro area, let aside other places. And they thought that with low growth, Italy would never have been able to keep the debt stable. So the opposite, if you want, view to what Olivier was saying is not only a question of confidence. You have to convince investors. Remember that half of the Italian debt at the time was held abroad, so it's a large amount of debt. It was not simply a question of bringing back confidence, or if you want, the only way to bring back confidence was to convince those who are holding the debt that growth would resume, because without growth it was very difficult to keep the debt stable. So what was the policy response to the shock, to the loss of confidence? So this is the fiscal. So the fiscal plan was half the responsibility of the Berlusconi government, maybe. Well, almost a half, so before they gave up in November of 2011, and half the responsibility of the following government led by the president of my university, Mario Monti, who took over at the end of November in 11. So they share the responsibility or the merit of what they did. So these are the numbers. They did a significant shift in the budget. They increased taxes by 3% of GDP, bringing the average tax rate from 46.5 to 49.5, almost half of GDP. They cut spending a bit by 0.2, so almost nothing. But because spending was cut by 1% of GDP, but the interest cost of the debt, because interest rates by then were rising, took out most of the benefit of the cut in spending. So overall, the thing was 0.2, 0.3. So this was a large fiscal adjustment, so 3% of GDP done over 2 years in a year of recession. That done on paper, 2/3 with higher taxes, 63% with higher taxes, and about 1/3 with lower spending. However, these are the official numbers. If you look a bit behind the official numbers, you realize that this 1% cut in spending was not really a reduction in spending by the government. This was mostly reduction in the transfers from the central government to local authorities, to city, regions, and provinces. And most of these local authorities reacted to the cut in transfer by the central government by raising local taxes. So if you do the numbers right, you realize that almost the entire adjustment, 3% of GDP, was done one way or another through higher taxes. So if you do the numbers, about 80% higher taxes and 20% lower spending. So this was the adjustment. What was the outcome? Well, the multiplier was not favorable because you raised taxes 3% of GDP. Growth in the year that just closed was minus 2.2. So we went from 0 in 2011, plus 0.2 to minus 2.2. The implied contemporaneous multiplier, so the instantaneous multiplier in the same year, was about 0.8. The IMF forecast for this year is another year of recession, -1, which implies that the 2-year multiplier, so the effect on output of the 3% increase in the revenue over a year, is about 1. Now, of course, because the economy was and is collapsing, debt is rising. So it started from 120. It will end this year at 126. Now, it depends. Part of the 126 is due to the money that Italy has contributed to the bailout of Greece. So if you take that out, the debt only goes to 122, but we are responsible for that as well. So the primary surplus the target was 3.8 for this year, so it is a reasonable primary surplus. The problem is that with minus 1% growth, and inflation now is close to zero, you would need 7% to keep the debt stable. So this is what the disappearance of growth does to you when you have a high debt. So this is the situation today with, so this quarter here, the first quarter of 2013, will be the eighth consecutive quarter of negative growth, and the -1 the IMF is forecasting for the year means another 2 years of negative growth and maybe zero turning around at the end of the year. So there was if you look back in history 20 years back, there is one episode which is reminiscent of what happened here, of course, in an international environment that was very different. Between 1991 and 1998, when Italy had to meet the Maastricht criteria to join the euro, there was also a very large improvement in the fiscal position, which amounted to 6% of GDP. The composition was more or less similar, was 70% higher taxes, 30% lower spending. What was the outcome of that similar fiscal correction? In 1993, so the correction was announced in September 92, just the month after the lira was forced out of the European monetary system, which was at the time the arrangement linking the various currencies to the Deutschmark. In 1993, private consumption fell 3%. Private consumption, for those of you who are not economists, is a very stable variable. A fall in real consumption by 3% happens once in half a century. But not only, what is worrisome is not only a drop in consumption, therefore in output in 93, but if you look at the following years and you look at the deviation of consumption in Italy from the average of the Euro 12, from 94 to 99, we were online, so the deviation was zero, but because in the meantime we devalued 50%, because after we left the ERM, the lira went down a lot. But the moment we joined the euro, the memory of that fiscal adjustment probably, so it's hard to prove, but the outcome is that consumption was 0.5% below the average of the euro area for a number of years thereafter. So there was a long memory of the tax-based fiscal correction of those years. Not always negative. There is one thing that is positive of what has been done. One important imbalance was corrected. So the impact on the budget of aging, which is pensions and healthcare, has been set essentially to zero. So this is the IMF estimate of the net present value in the coming 40 years. So how much it will cost in the coming 40 years to take care of pensions and health care for the population, discounted at some interest rate. You see there are countries like the US that have a lot of work to do. So the IMF estimate of the impact is almost 200% of GDP. So this is the sum, of course, over 40 years of what it would cost, what the impact would be on the US federal budget of aging in the coming 40 years, a very large number. And you see that Italy is happily down here. So the arrow here is on Japan. I meant to be on Italy. Sorry. Which there is something, but it is very small. So this has been at least one worry that is out of, and this is a result of the pension and health reform done in the 90s and then repeated over and over again until the last pension reform that Mario Monti did exactly a year ago. So the question, if I've convinced you, I don't know if I have, that when you have high debt, if you don't grow, you are in trouble. The issue is, why has Italy stopped growing? Because I think you have to ask why you have stopped growing before asking what you have to do to grow. And I think there are, we can have very different views, but at least I think there are three which are non-mutually exclusive possibilities for why growth has stopped. One is the size of the public sector, which has increased, and with an increase in the size of the public sector, the tax revenue as a share of GDP, as we've seen, has gone to 50%, and this doesn't help private demand. But I want to emphasize not only taxes, but the size of the private sector, because if the private sector is big, there is no way you can reduce taxes. The second one is the euro, which could be a factor in why Italy has stopped growing. And the other one is a less obvious thing on which I want to draw your attention in a minute, which is the failed transition from a phase where a country grows through imitation to a phase where a country grows through innovation, what I call the Japanese syndrome, because it's a syndrome that makes Italy very similar in this sense to Japan. So let's go through them one by one. So the size of the public sector. So in Italy is not the largest public sector in the euro area. France is larger. Of course, then the next question is how effective it is, because Sweden also has large public sector, but the efficiency of the Swedish public sector may be different between Italy and France. I'm not sure. Anyway, we are around 50%. I've put the numbers for Germany here because we often discuss the fact that Germany is doing so well, Germany is so different. And we have to remember that under Chancellor Schröder, who maybe because of this lost the election, was not re-elected, Germany did a lot of work, not only through the hard reform in changing the rules of the labor market, but also in shrinking the public sector. So expenditure, which is a measure, public expenditure, which is a measure of the size of the public sector, went down 5% of GDP between 96 and actually 6% between 96 and 97. So this is part Kohl and part the beginning of Schröder, and then went up a bit in the crisis, but only 1%. So Germany did a lot of work in reducing the size of the private sector and therefore reducing the pressure of taxes on the economy. And these numbers are important because it's not only labor market reform. Germany did a lot also in the size of the private sector. And the observation is here that maybe the countries down below could do the same if you think that high taxes are not good for growth. So that was the size of the public sector. The second is the euro. So this is what happened to unit labor cost. So the cost per unit, the cost of labor per unit of output, setting these four countries, Germany, France, Spain and Italy, to 100 when the euro started in 99 and running to last year. And they're not enormously different. I mean, what is different here is Germany, which actually reduced unit labor cost through wage moderation and increase in productivity, and then only let labor cost increase a bit during the crisis. And this increase in labor cost is because Germany has used the system of dividing in the crisis rather than in allowing firms to lay off workers, to reduce hours worked so as to keep workers on the payroll but at lower hours. And you see this because the unit labor cost increased, but we are still miles below these countries. There's another interesting thing in this graph, that Spain, which of course was the fastest running, has shifted. So unit labor costs in Spain are falling. They're now below, if you were to increase this, they're below France and Italy. So Spain is doing an adjustment, of course, coming from a very high level. So maybe part of the reason Italy is not growing is simply that unit labor costs have increased a lot and competitiveness of the economy has fallen. Why have unit labor costs increased? So this is an attempt to divide, and I apologize for the Italian, the increase in labor costs in two components. This is hourly labor productivity, and this is total factor productivity. Total factor productivity is more worrisome. So hourly labor productivity essentially remains flat. We would expect that in an increase, productivity increases, and it increases in all countries except Italy. Even in Spain, our labor productivity was increasing a bit. But what is more worrisome is that total factor productivity, which for the layman is how efficient a country is to use the capital it has and the labor it has, to put them together efficiently. This has been falling throughout. Essentially, since we joined the euro, total factor productivity is increasing, and this is a worrisome thing because it tells something of a country is no longer able to use efficiently the resources it has. Why is TFP so low? So one possibility that has been discussed a lot in Italy is that we are in the wrong sectors. We are in the wrong place. So this is an exercise that the Bank of Italy has done, trying to recompute Italian industrial production using not the structure, the composition by industry of Italy, which is the black line, but in the red and green line using what Italy would have produced had the output of Italian industry had the same structure as the output in France and in Germany. No big difference, right? It's had we been French, probably output would have been slightly higher, but there is no big deal, which means it's not really the composition that we are in the wrong sectors. This, I think, tells a lot. This is a nice graph from Fabiano Schivardi, who is an economist at LUIS in Rome. And what Fabiano has done has computed the variance of profits and productivity across Italian firms. So he has taken microdata for individual firms and look what the variance, so how dispersed profits and productivity are across firms from 1990 up to today. And what is interesting here is that from the start of the euro, the variance jumps up, increases a lot. So forget about the level. I mean, the level is country specific. But the fact that the variance jumps up a lot, Fabiano's interpretation of this graph is that Italian firms have really divided, are much more different from one another today than they were 20 years ago. And by looking a bit more carefully at the data, he identifies essentially two groups of firms. There is one group of firms that are the firms where productivity is increasing and profits are increasing. These are firms that used the euro as an occasion to restructure. They understood that easy devaluation were no longer an option. To be competitive in international markets, you had to get your act together, raise productivity and profits, and this did a lot, and these are the firms that are exporting. Then you have a different bunch of firms who did almost nothing, where instead productivity and profits were falling. And this is the explanation for why the variance within this group, these firms, this is the universe of firms, I think above a minimum amount of workers is going up. And this is interesting, but this tells a story. What I usually tell my students is stop looking at the averages. The averages for Italy are becoming increasingly meaningless. but not, as you would think, the average between the North and the South. It's not a regional difference, although there are regional differences. The difference is between those firms that are exposed to international competition, that are exporters, and those firms that only sell on the domestic market. They are protected internally from all sort of laws that protect them, and that can survive. They should leave the market, but they survive with low profits, low productivity, because they are protected. So the average is 0, but 0 is an average of plus 10 and minus 10. And another element of this is Italy is a country that has essentially an almost balanced trade balance. So the trade has recently moved a little bit into deficit, but on balance, trade is balanced. And because Italy doesn't produce a drop of oil or of gas, all the energy that is used in the country is paid for by these firms that are exporters, so that allow the trade balance to be balanced. So it's important to realize that this graph capture the idea that there are really two different countries, those that have used the euro to become productive, to increase productivity and profits, and they export typically 80% of their output, and those who are instead domestically oriented, they should leave the market, and they don't because they are. And I think this tells a lot about why the country has stopped growing, because the difference between these two groups of firms has increased a lot. So there is if you think about this country with these two groups of firms, there is an interesting observation done by three economists, one of them at the New York Fed, Paolo Pesenti, and they make an interesting observation. They say, if you have a country like which has a problem of loss of competitiveness, like this here. So there are two ways to do the adjustment. There is a tough way, which is to reduce nominal wages, because now under a fixed exchange rate you have to reduce nominal wages, or increase productivity faster than Germany, which is difficult. But there is another way you can adjust, and the other way you can adjust, which is, as I say, not as dramatic, is to allow those firms that are unproductive to exit the market and allow productive firms to come in, to change the composition of output, raising the output of those productive firms and maybe allowing them to sell also on the domestic market. And what they show, which I think is interesting, that changing the composition of firms is not a complete substitute, but goes a long way to substitute for a cut in nominal wages, which is instead what you need to do if the composition of output is fixed. And this, I think, is the problem, that this reallocation of output from the unproductive sector of the economy to the productive sector of the economy is difficult. If you want, it's not such a bad situation, because if you did not have the productive sector of the economy, if 0 was the mean, but 0 was also for everybody, you'd be in trouble, right? Now, you have a part which is productive. You have to allow this part of the economy to increase and to shrink the other part. If you do this, I think there is a future. So there is a relatively easy future. The issue is how to do it. There are other problems. So this is an interesting, it looks at the percentage of firms that are exposed. This is to tell you that it is not, for those firms that are productive, it is not a competitiveness problem. So this is the percent of firms exporting to selected markets abroad. So this here are the firms that are exporting to China and India, exporting to other Asian countries, to the US and Canada, and these are the countries. So if you look at this, look at the last column, you see that 37% of German firms, so a bit more than 1 out of 3, is able to export to the US and Canada, 32% in France, 30% in Italy. So it's not that Italian firms, those who export because they're uncompetitive, are no longer able to go there. They go there more or less like France and German firms, while Spanish firms, only 18% go to the US. But because Italian firms are typically very small, if you go to the US, it's easy, right? Everybody speaks English, going to the US and Canada is easy. But you have to go to the rest of Asia, say to Vietnam or to Thailand, to markets that are growing fast. Then if you're a small firm in Veneto, it's very difficult to go to Thailand. And you see, while 26% of German firms are exporting to the rest of Asia, only 14%, actually less than in Spain. So this is to say that even in that part of the economy that is able to export, the size of the firms, and we'll get to a moment to why the size is so small, it's a limitation to the ability to export. So why the size is small? I repeat, now we're talking about the productive part of the economy, let aside the unproductive part. Most of these productive firms, they're family owned. 85.6% are owned by what in the US we call them private companies. But this is not very different. Actually, in Germany, the private companies are 90%, so it's actually more. What is worrisome in Italy is that the management is all in-house. So 66% of the management of these private held companies is the family. And much as your kids are wonderful, it's never a good idea to let your company be run by your kid. You see, Germany has 90% of the German companies are privately held, but only 28% have domestic home family management. And this is a problem, because if you want the management to be your son or your daughter or your nephew or your son-in-law, you're not going to grow very fast. And this is one of the issues. Why? I think this has to do with probably with culture before even thinking about financial market. But this is one big issue in why firms are small, and firm being small has the drawback that I mentioned just above. So this was, I'm almost done. This was to talk about the productive part, which has a problem of its own. So remember we said, going back to the Schivardi graph, we want to eliminate this big variance. We want to get rid of the unproductive firms and to increase the room of the productive ones. Why doesn't this happen? Well, because economics works. These are the profit margins in Italy compared to the rest of the euro area. So if you're in the service sector, and the service sector is typically all domestic, your profit margins are 60% in Italy. They're high. They're higher than in manufacturing, even in the rest of the euro area, but 35%. They're almost half of Italy. If you're in the manufacturing, you do exactly like the euro area. You have a 20% margin, which is you can live with, but it's certainly small. So if you are an entrepreneur and you decide where to invest, this says exactly where to invest. So you look at families like famous families in the Northeast that used to produce the sweaters that many of you are wearing tonight. What you do, you close down or you scale down your sweater company, and you enter in telecoms, in highways, in services where your profit margins are. Why the profit margins big? Because these are highly protected industries where if Mike and I would want to enter to get part of the 60%, it'd be pretty hard. And this says all. If you, another important area, for example, all of the services provided by cities, waste disposal, water, electricity, all the services that cities provide are typically provided by companies that are at least 51% owned by the city. So these are areas where you would like to expand, but you cannot because the city would not reduce its presence as a shareholder of this company. So this tells you why shifting capital from the unproductive to the productive part of the economy, which would mean making services more productive, is difficult because they are high. I call this profit margin, but these are really rents, right? Because 60% is a rent, are high to eliminate. Why Italy is not growing, possibility number 3, this is completely different. Maybe, I don't know if it's completely wrong, but I'm fascinated by a paper by Darona Cemoglu of MIT, Philippe Aguillon, who is at Harvard, and Fabrizio Zilibotti in Zurich, which was published a few years ago. And they have, I think, a very interesting idea about why countries grow fast and then don't grow, which maybe all of us who studied growth theory would find it relatively easy. But I think it goes a long way into understanding why Japan has stopped growing beyond the financial crisis, and maybe why Italy has stopped growing. So countries, when they are far away from the technological frontier, growing is easy, right? Think of Italy in the 1950s and 60s. Mr. Agnelli would come to the US, learn how you produce cars from Ford or from GM, go back to Torino and produce cars. Typically the design was better than in Detroit. The cars would also run better, like the Toyota cars would run better. But they were cars, right? So the technology was US technology. Then it was improved upon, but there was no real innovation. It was mostly intelligent imitation. All the thing which was called white goods, it was a big industry in Italy in the 60s, refrigerators, kitchen, the thing, was all US technology. Again, the design was infinitely better if done by Zanussi than by the corresponding US company, but the technology was US technology. And if you think about Japan, a lot is not all. I mean, this is making life simple, but if you think a lot of the technological advances in the 80s in Japan in electronics, the technology was really developed in the US, and then the Japanese was very good at doing the electronics better than the US, but there was no real or certainly not enormous innovation. Then you arrive at the technological frontier, and then you have to start to innovate because there's nothing more you can imitate. And then life gets difficult. Why? Because the institutions that are good in the face of imitation are no longer the good ones when you have to innovate. So in the face of imitation, you need large companies, for example, the state-owned companies, Iri, which was this big state-owned conglomerate in Italy, or MITI, the industry ministry in Japan, the big banks, the close connection between banks and industry, very stable management. In the face of imitation is good, right? You want to have a big factory, a guy there telling you have to do this, and watching that you do it right. You don't have to imitate. You would never grow Apple or another company like this in a country where you are good at imitating. Why? Because a large bank will never finance Steve Jobs in his basement, and the Japanese or Italian structure of industry in the 50s and 60s is not good for the innovation. So one, I think, this is not, I mean, this is an intuition that these three economists have. I think it's a very interesting intuition that should be studied more. But I think that one of the reasons why this country stopped is because they were unable to change. Why they were unable? Because when you build these big institutions that are crucial in the imitation phase, you don't just dismantle them from the day to the next. You don't just dismantle the large banks, the large conglomerates. They become very powerful, they have political links, they stay there long after they have survived their usefulness. And this, I think, is part of what is happening in Italy as well. Part of the difficulty in reallocating capital from the unproductive to the productive part of the economy. So, and I'm done, so what prevents the reallocation? I think politics is central, because if you have to reallocate capital, you have real interest in the economy and society that have to be changed. And if you look, and I don't know if I should do this, but we are 5 days ahead of the elections. I think we can do this. If you look at the two big parties that are competing in the Italian election, unfortunately, in my view, none of them has an incentive to reallocate capital from the unproductive to the productive part of the economy. The PDL, the center-right, has a culture which couldn't be further away from competition. If you think of the leader of the center-right, he has been a wonderful entrepreneur. There's no doubt about that. But in three sectors that are typically protected sectors, he started in real estate, continued in the media, and in insurance. So if you think of three sectors that are protected, regulated, where good relations with the government are crucial, those are real estate, insurance, and media. So he's not a person that has ever been open or exposed to international competition. He doesn't understand it, because he said, I've been very successful, and why should I think about how difficult it is to export to Thailand? So this is not a part of the political spectrum where you will find a lot of enthusiasm. And if you look at the composition of the members of parliament for the center-right, both those who were in Parliament until last week and will be in Parliament as of next week. I think 3 out of 5 of them are lawyers. So you're not going to open up the legal profession, which is one of the big issues in Italy, if 3 out of 5 members of Parliament of this part are lawyers. On the other side, you have the Democratic Party, which has a problem, because the Democratic Party relies for its support on the unions. And the unions today essentially represent either retired workers, for example, CGL, the biggest union which represents the left, more than 50% of the members of this union are retired workers. So it is almost surprising that it was able to do this big pension reform with a powerful union that is representing retired workers, while, because the pension reform was not mostly, but a lot done by hitting the young people and not the other. And the unions is very strong in incumbent firms, precisely in those firms that would like to move out of the market to make room for the new entrants, which could shift the balance. So this may not be a very promising view of the election, but my view is that this is a country that can really do it. It is possible to stop the decline, so to stop what we saw in the first graph, but you really ask yourself, if you're an investor, assume one of you is an investor, ask yourself, who is winning the battle between the productive part and the unproductive part, which sort of match each other, because remember, the trade balance is 0. Italy doesn't borrow from the rest of the world, but doesn't grow, because so far the unproductive part has been the stronger one. I stop here, but now we can discuss for as long as you want.